Hello. So usually when I make a video, I like to know kind of what I'm doing, because that makes the videos better. And people have said, Ian, actually it'd be cool if you made a video where you're just figuring things out, except me figuring things out looks like this. Because it's just me thinking, which isn't great television. But that's what I want to try to do today, because I have some things that are going to require quite a bit of figuring out. So I mentioned in previous videos that I'm working on this shot, which is kind of a big construction type flying vehicle landing, and it has kind of a modular payload bay that is currently being used for like human transport. And Tom gets out and he looks into the airport viewing area. But I think it'd be fun to extend this shot backwards. You actually see the ship coming in and kind of settling down, and this overly complicated landing gear opening up and coming to rest on the ground. And because I just love overly complicated landing gear. But there's a lot I have to figure out. Mostly just about how the rigging works, because, I don't know, where do I start? First off, as a quick recap, there's forward kinematics and inverse kinematics. And forward kinematics means you rotate the bones, and every subsequent bone in the chain is affected by that translation. Inverse kinematics is where you actually move the last bone, and it solves for all of the previous bones to make sure that these end up in this position. And actually, just to get specific, this bone isn't actually connected in the chain. This is just the control bone, and this bone is the last bone in the chain that's solving to the control bone. So while the ship is parked on the ground, you want an IK solution, because I want the landing gear to be planted firmly on the ground, and even if the ship still moves a little bit, it's still solving. This is my temporary, very kind of janky setup here. But when it's in the air, you want FK, because you want whatever the ship is doing to control all of this other stuff. In fact, I want all of this landing gear to kind of fold up and do all of this crazy stuff and get nice and compact and kind of be stored up here on top of the ship. Fortunately, that part is really easy to fix. So here's the control bone, and here is the bone with the IK constraint. If we go under the constraints tab, we can just turn the influence to 0, and now the chain will ignore the control bone, which means we can animate the landing gear kind of deploying in FK mode, and then once it gets close to the control bone, we can just add some keyframes and animate it, reconnecting, and have the IK take over. So that part's pretty cool. But I actually kind of like this as a concept for the design, where there's a wheel in the back and a wheel in the front, and maybe a final kind of like heavy support piece that comes down at the end, just in case it's carrying something like really heavy. And oh, I should show you this, because I love working with IK. You know, it's a really good way to have a whole bunch of things happen by just moving one bone. And Nathan showed me a really good tip. So we can grab this one here and turn the influence for the IK down. Now this is just a standard FK chain, but this affects the IK. This is the starting orientation it'll use to solve the IK. So if we start like this and then turn up the influence, you can see it uses just the path of least resistance to get there. Whereas if we do something kind of like this, all zigzaggy, this will be the starting position, and we connect it, and it still kind of maintains some of that original shape, which is why you can kind of move the IK chain just by grabbing random bones and moving them around like this. It's because here, if we kind of do this, we are actually rotating the underlying arrangement of the IK chain. Here, if I turn this down, this is actually what I've been doing. That trick ends up being useful quite a bit, actually. Okay, so what this video was going to be is it was going to be me trying to figure out how to rig up something like this, where when the wheels hit the ground, they automatically displace out to the sides like this. So it's kind of, you know, a situation like, you know, like that. Because there's a lot of challenges with that. It's not maybe as easy as you might think. The problem is that I've already done it. Look at this. This shot's still in progress, but I've made a lot of good progress on the ship. I'm pretty happy with that. And the way the landing gear kind of works, it works very much like I was hoping it would. But it turns out the only thing harder than trying to figure out how to do something complicated, at least for me, is making a video where I explain my thinking along the way. So I'm going to explain retroactively, and then I'm going to explain the actual right way to do it, which I figured out too late. And then I think we'll just work through a couple different mechanical linkages and kind of like play around and see how, you know, the simple machines and things that we can use, so that if you're ever doing a robot, you can have all of the different mechanisms actually make sense instead of just doing a bunch of kind of random pistons and stuff, because that's my challenge for me right now. A lot of times now I'm covering things in hydraulics and pistons that give the illusion of something looking like it actually makes sense, but it doesn't actually make sense. But if I just try a little bit harder, I can actually design a thing that'll hold up, hopefully, to a little bit of scrutiny. Because me and my big old ego, if somebody's mechanically inclined and they're watching the episode, I want them to be like, oh, okay, I see what you did, and not like, well, that's a bunch of nonsense, so Okay, here we go. So okay, we've got the main hub of the landing gear here, and then we have a wheel out here on the end of an arm, and there'll be another one over here, but we'll just pretend that one's there. And what we want is when the wheel hits a certain distance from the ground, first it stops going downwards, and two, it moves out the correct distance away from this as this keeps going downwards. And so, you know, we end up in a situation like this. The obvious difficulty is that because this is all on a computer, there's not actually anything there to stop the wheel. So we've got to set that all up by hand. And this was kind of exciting because this is a triangle. Like if we go from here to here down to the hub of the wheel and then over here, because this is just going to be, you know, the radius of the wheel is just going to be a constant offset from the ground. And then we go down to here, you know, the distance from the hub to the ground, we have a right angle triangle. And humanity has absolutely figured out everything about right triangles. That's all like trigonometry and cosines and all of that stuff that I've been trying to learn, but haven't really wrapped my head around. So just right off the bat, I knew there was a solution here somehow. And also, IK is really good at solving triangles. Like here's a triangle right here. If we move this up and down, it's solving triangles. Like if we move this up and down, it's figuring out the angles that these need to be in order to maintain a constant length and all of that. And there was a YouTube video I was watching at one point. I think it was a new Veritasium that was talking about the process of becoming an expert at something. And I am not an expert at this at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm the opposite. That's why I want to figure this out. But what it said was basically people who become experts just know how to recognize previously identified and solved patterns. One of my favorite things to do is watching woodworkers, you know, like they're doing their little video time lapses, because every time they have a little problem, they've already figured out, there's already a solution for it. They've learned, you know, in their past experience. And so you're watching the end result of all of these little tricks of like how they keep things offset and how they measure things accurately, or like mechanical engineers. It's just have this huge backlog of stuff. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, I know there's the solution in here somewhere. Like it's dinging all the lights. I couldn't figure out what in the world it was, because okay, so we have this triangle here. Here, let's move over here. So this edge right here is the hypotenuse, and we know it has to stay the same length the entire time because it's literally just going to be this bar right here. And so as all of this goes downwards, this point can't go any further. It's against the ground. And so as this line gets shorter, this line right here has to get longer in order to allow the hypotenuse to stay the same length. And so that means there's some ratio between the length of this edge right here and the length of this other line down here. And I was trying to figure out what that was. Oh, Ian, you know this. It's the only other piece of triangle trivia you possess. Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I believe the hypotenuse is c squared. Which means you take the length of that bar, you know, that connects the thing, and you multiply it by itself, you square it, and then you take the length of the distance from the top of that bar to the ground, you square that, and you subtract one from the other, and you get the square root of that, and that's the length of the distance that one should be from the other. Yes, that is the best thing middle school taught me, and it was finally useful just now. A little too late, though. And I was also trying to figure out where I could get the information of the distance from here to even control, you know, the distance here, even if I did figure out that ratio. And I was thinking, okay, so I can set up a bone that represents the ground, and that'll be a reference point. And I know there's we'll get into, I'll actually walk you through this in a second, but we can have this bone act as a floor for all the other bones that come through, except for another bone that is allowed to pass through, and the distance between that bone and the floor bone, like along this axis, will be the amount of compression we have here, which should translate to how much this needs to be displaced. So what I like right now is that there are a few probably mechanically inclined people who have figured out this sort of thing in the past, who, to them, it is incredibly obvious. They're like, Ian, how are you so close and yet not seeing the actual solution? Or at least a better solution than all of this nonsense. And to you I say, I am so happy that you are just so clever, but I gotta play a little bit of catch up. And let's actually start making stuff. So here, I'm going to Shift S, snap cursor to the grid. I never do this. There we go. We'll actually try to keep things a little bit square. Shift A, add an armature, and I'm going to do something I don't normally do, and that's label the bones. So if we go into edit mode, tab into edit mode, and hit F2, we can name it floor, and this will just be our reference for where the ground is, so the rest of the rig knows. And we can change this at, any time. And actually, I'm going to move this over here because I think the floor is going to extend out in every direction just along that axis away from the bone. So, okay, this will be another bone. This will be the bone that stops when it hits the floor. And so, just let's go into, and one of the most frustrating things about setting up rigs when you're getting into it is that there's two different modes. There's edit mode and there's pose mode, and you can only do certain things in each of those modes, and they're not always all that intuitive. Like right here, okay, we've got this bone, going to create another bone, and I'm going to shift click on this, Control P, parent, keep offset, and so now this is the parent. But you'll notice we can still, we're in edit mode, we can still move things around, we can change everything. We have to go into pose mode in order to actually see that setup, which makes you think that you set up all of the relationships between the bones and how they interact in edit mode. Except if we're going to be adding a constraint, which it kind of gives us all of these different rules for what bones can and can't do, which we're going to be using, you do that in pose mode. It's confusing to me. Maybe it's confusing to you. Anyways, we'll go back into edit mode. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to create another bone. Just scale it up right here. This will be the control bone, and I am going to parent this bone here to the control bone. And so let's see. This will be what do we call this? Bone that hits floor, and this will be F2 control bone. Okay, now if we go into pose mode, we can move this up and down like this. I'm going to select this bone, go into our bone constraints tab, and go to floor, which lets us select our armature and the, oh, did I not label this bone? Oh, I didn't. F2 floor. There we go. Okay, back into pose mode. So now I can select floor, and does it just work? Yes! And now this bone here, the bone that hits floor, hits the floor. So again, my original thought was I would have one bone here, another bone here, and both of these would also be parented to this one. And here, let's copy this bone constraint. Control C, copy bone constraints, and here they'd all be lined up like this. So my thinking was, as the landing gear descends, this bone is allowed to keep going past the floor. I get the distance, the amount this bone is, either under the floor or under the bone that hits the floor, and that number translates into an offset for this bone. And so as this goes down, this goes out here for the wheel, and it all kind of works. The issue is that this bone moving down would be linear, but the motion of this bone here should kind of follow a parabola as this line becomes flatter and flatter against the ground. It can't just keep going on forever. But yeah, I couldn't figure any of that out, so I'm going to delete all of this, and let me show you my very silly solution. So we're back in edit mode. I'm going to grab the top of this bone, hit E to extrude out another bone, rotate it 180 degrees so it's pointing straight downwards, and kind of line this up down here. I don't know how much that matters. Now if I go back into pose mode, you can see we got it working. The floor, it's still stopping when it hits the floor. I'm going to grab this bone, add a stretch to constraint, which is another situation where I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was just looking through all the constraints, and I was like, okay, wait, we can use that. Target it to bone that hits floor, and now this bone just stretches between these two bones, which is kind of a cool effect, actually. One thing you'll notice, though, is as the bone gets shorter, it's also spreading out, and that's because maintain volume is turned on, and we can actually change kind of the ratio of how that works. What does this mean? Okay, well, let's go back into edit mode here. I'm going to create another bone. And here, let's see, we'll put it right here where a theoretical wheel is, and I'm going to parent it to that stretch bone. Keep offset, go back into pose mode. But now as this goes down and the stretch to bone gets wider, this other wheel bone also moves outwards in the way we want it. Of course, it is doing it backwards, like it's doing a parabola, but now the closer that the shorter this gets, this will just infinitely keep stretching out to the horizon, whereas it shouldn't really go any longer than the the hypotenuse of the wheel here. But I decided, that's okay. Maybe I can just kind of live with that. But there were two obvious issues. The first one is this bone. Here, let's actually make a wheel really quick. Gonna rotate this, line it up there, and just scale it so the radius, so it's kind of hitting the ground. If I shift click on this and go into pose mode, select this and hit Control P, I can parent it to that bone, and there we go. I mean, that's the whole issue right there, is the stretch bone. This is within the translation space of the stretch bone, which is scaling it downwards and outwards, which is also happening to our wheel, which we don't want. To bypass this, to layer on top of all of this insanity, I duplicated this bone here. I'm going to hit Alt P to clear the parent. It's just its own bone now. Here, let's make it a little bit larger so we can see what we're doing. Gonna go into pose mode, select this, do a copy location constraint, And actually here, let's name this. This bone will be F2 wheel target, and this bone here will copy the location of the wheel target. Now, why is that important? It's because all it's copying is the location. It doesn't care about the scale or anything else that's happening. So now if we swap the wheel to parent that bone instead, we now have a buffer between all of those, scaling translations, and the wheel doesn't deform, but it does move. You do notice though, it does go underground, so then I click this and I added my usual floor constraint here, armature 1, floor. And what's cool about that is it has an offset. And so here, let's see, let's bring this down like this. I can just raise up the offset, and so it'll always just be this consistent height. This is the radius of the wheel here, above the ground. And so dun, 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 now it's moving. It's kind of, the wheel will just keep going off forever. But that was close enough to kind of to what I was thinking. And then to connect the two, I was going to do some nonsense kind of IK stuff here. Here we've got a bone. We'll parent it to this wheel bone here. Keep offset. Add a couple other cool segments, and we'll parent it to this one. If we go into pose mode, grab this, shift click on this one, and hit Shift I to active bones. And here, let's make the chain length so it only goes the length of this. Now there's a linkage here that controls the whole thing, and that is actually what I used in the video there as the landing gear comes out, which is why the wheels kind of start moving in a weird way. And like you can see I massaged everything to kind of make it work, but only had to work for one shot, so that was okay. Okay, so what is a better way to do this? Because you guys remember when I was doing this example here. Okay, so check this out. We create our armature, go into edit mode. I'm just gonna snap it to the grid a little bit, make a nice clean triangle. I'm gonna create the floor bone that we've already made before, and I'm gonna duplicate it, and this will just be the overall control bone. I'm gonna parent both the floor bone and the IK chain to that control bone, keep offset, go back into pose mode, doing our usual. Click on the control thing, shift click on the IK chain to active bones, and that should be, it's doing our IK chain, but it's going too far, so I'm gonna grab this, turn up the chain length to just be 2 bones, and so now, this goes up, only does that. Apply our floor constraint. Here, let's just add another bone here, and we call it floor. Apply our floor constraint to that, and now as it goes down, it does this, and can you see it? Can you see it? Because I was that dick who was in the middle of a conversation with a friend, and they're talking, and I was like, and they're like, what? And I was like, sorry, I just figured something out. And then I came home, because bones are just placeholders. Here, if we put a cube here, line it up with this bone, and parent it to there, Control P, parent to bone, it'll do that. But also, if we move it way out here, it'll do the exact same thing. It's just in the translation space of that bone. So what happens if we use it as an extension of that bone? Well, we are just continuing. We're basically just doing this bone right here, but flipped. And look at that. That is exactly what we wanted. In fact, here, let's bring this down a little bit, and so it's more straight. And then as it gets close to the ground, it unfolds, and it does that parabola shape I was talking about, where it goes really fast when it first moves out, but then it slows down as it's kind of tracing that out. Let's create a little wheel here at the end, and I think I can just go into pose mode here and grab this and change the offset so that the wheel is like that, and it should still all just work perfectly, or at least it works close enough. I probably have something a little bit sloppy in here, but yeah, this is the solution. I assume that all of the aeronautics engineers have been very patiently waiting for me to come up with, and this is mostly just an example of why I probably shouldn't be making tutorials about this sort of stuff before I've really had all of those experiences. But I'm very much into linkages these days, because this gets me excited. If you just type linkages into Google, you get all of these different mechanisms and stuff, and look at this. These things kind of transform. If you've ever seen, oh yeah, these walking guys here, these are all just clever linkages, and we can model a lot of these just using an IK setup. And once you kind of wrap your head around it, it's not, I mean, it can be very confusing, but the basic tools are fairly straightforward. So let's see. Let's go through some of the mechanism basics. If you type in linkages, you see this collection of 4 over and over. Let's see. Is this? Yeah. And so let's see if we can figure out how to model these in Blender. And let's try doing it from what I perceive as kind of the simplest to the most complex. This one we've already done. Let's do it again. So Shift A, add an armature, tab into edit mode, and I'm just going to make a little V like this, and then Shift S, cursor to selected, just to keep everything nice and clean, and Shift A to add a new bone, and this will be the control bone here. Here, we'll rotate it 90 degrees, go into pose mode, click on this, shift click on this, then Shift I, and there we go. We've set up our IK, and so we would be animating this to control the rest of the arm. Okay, so that's the easy one. And actually, this is already looking more complicated than I expected. So I'm gonna try doing it with 2 IK chains. It's possible you could easily do it with 1, and there's something I'm kind of overlooking. But yeah, I'm gonna try setting up one. Well, you'll see. Shift A, add an armature, tab into edit mode, rotate it 90 degrees. This will be our kind of a control bone, extruding it out into the first kind of linkage. And then I'm gonna go down to the pivot point right here. And so that'll actually be here. Shift S, cursor selected, create our own little control bone here for the IK. Select this, shift click on this, Shift I to active bone. And now if we move this, we've got our first linkage, although you can see the blue bone is also rotating, and I actually want to imply that that's, you know, like a piston inside like a shaft, and so it can only move on one axis. And so I'm going to lock all of these IKs here, and now it can only move like this, and it won't rotate as part of the IK chain. We're going to be using that quite a bit, actually. So this is the first bit. Tab back into edit mode. I'm going to create another bone. Shift S, cursor to grid, create a bone here, and it's going to rotate 180 degrees here, and I'm going to parent it to this bone right here. Control P. So now this is effectively just within this rotational plane here. If we go into here, you can see it's rotating the same as that. But you know how parenting works. So the tricky thing with IK chains is they're connecting 2 points. They're solving from one point to another. And these diagrams are actually cheating a little bit, because if you actually had this and you're pushing on this one wouldn't be going straight like this. It would be rotating with this other piece, unless if there's some other mechanism keeping it straight. And so we have to model that into our system. So what I want to do is I'm going to have, you know, the hinge piece here, and then I have this bone that'll be going down here that's also on a hinge that'll be going to the end of a piston, which can only be going straight up and down along this axis, and this linkage here will be kind of absorbing all of that rotation, so the piston is free to only go up and down. And the way I'm going to do that is here. This will be that rotational linkage, and then I'll extrude here. But that means this bone is just going to be sliding up and down. Remember, an IK chain wants to connect from one point to another point. So we need a kind of a buffer link in the chain. So I'm going to extrude this one more time. I know it sounds like I'm just making a bunch of stuff up, but this is just kind of how IK chains work. So here, I'm adding in the buffer bone. And let's see, let's Shift S, cursor to selected, add our little end of the IK chain control bone here. We go into pose mode. I think we have everything that we need. So I'm going to shift click on this, Shift I to active bone. Now notice right now the IK chain goes all, because this one's parented to this one, it goes all the way up through all of the parents all the way to the very beginning, which means this is not what we want. So I'm going to grab the IK here, go into the bone IK settings, or no, the constraint, and just turn it up so it is the length of the dotted line just goes to the start of this chain here. Okay, so we're going to do the exact same thing we did before. Select this bone, and under the IK constraints, we're going to lock it so it only moves up and down for this piston piece. And for this one here, I'm going to turn IK stretch up, which means it's allowed to expand and compress. And here, I'm going to lock that also. And ideally now, if we move this one, okay, this is kind of half working. When we look at this, it's doing the right thing. You can imagine the shape here is, you know, it would all be working. But down here, ideally, this would be going along one axis if it's going through, you know, the shaft of a piston. But if we look at it, it is rotating, and I don't know exactly why that is, because these are all locked. It could just be because it's the final bone. Its only job is to point at. And hello, Ian from the edit here. So this confused me at the time, and it really shouldn't have. I was thinking, well, I locked the IK. They shouldn't be rotating. They should be staying, you know, perfectly vertical. Except they're not rotating. Remember, they're in the translation space of the bone right here, which is their parent bone. And so this one's doing the rotation. Everything else is just being taken along for the ride. As long as these guys are concerned, they are staying completely straight. Anyways. There could be a better way to do this, but I'm just going to reverse it. I'm going to start down here. This will be the buffer bone. This will be the bone going through the piston, and this will be the final linkage going up to. Here, we'll make that, going up to the target for the IK chain. Here, we'll make that a little bit smaller. Parent that target so it's in the same, you know, object as this. Control P, keep offset, go back into pose mode. Oh, Alt G, move this to the original position. Shift click on this to make our little IK chain. And now I get to turn this one on to IK stretch, lock these, and lock these. And now this is doing exactly what we wanted. And if it's a little hard to see here, let me model it real quick. Okay, there we go. And now you'll see, here I'm going to moving this bone around, but I'm going to hide it. If we move this back and forth, everything slides in and out of the pistons, and it also just is turning the motion from one axis to another. So why is this stuff cool? It's because in robotics and stuff, usually the actuator or the motor or the engine or whatever, the thing providing the power is pretty intense. It's pretty heavy. And so if you have like robot fingers or whatever, you don't actually want a servo at every single joint. You want to have those servos somewhere else and able to translate the motion into your fingers. It's the exact same way with our hands. If you look at my tendons there, I don't have little motors in my fingers. It's being done all along my forearm, and that motion is just being translated into my hand. It's a very cool system. And I know I say it a lot, but I think kind of limiting yourself, being like, okay, I'm going to try to operate within real world physics and having a big actuator somewhere that translates somewhere else, giving yourself restrictions for the design will actually help the design in the long run. At least if I have to sketch a spaceship or something, my design will be probably pretty generic. But if I start thinking with certain restrictions and stuff in mind, then the ship will suddenly kind of start taking on a life of its own, and certain decisions will just become more obvious and interesting because it's actually the ship itself is kind of like designing it's engineering itself as I go. I guess I kind of made a whole video about that one with the Phaeton. But okay, next one. And let's see. I think I'm going to skip this one because between all the other ones, we'd cover everything. This would just require doing all the steps even more so. But this one could be interesting. You can imagine like a big industrial sci-fi door with a latch that kind of goes junk. You know, you've seen this kind of like a submarine hatch thing. Let's rig one of these. So first, let's see. Create an armature. This will be the central handle, and it will, rotate around this central point here. Let's create another bone over here. Where all of this stuff is going to start feeling pretty familiar, hopefully. This will be the stretching expansion bone. This will be the bolt, the bit that kind of locks into the side of the door, and this will be the hinge that connects it to the handle. Which means here, let's create our little IK control bone here, and if we go pose mode, Shift I to make that the IK. Here, I'm going to go back into edit mode. I can't remember if I remember the parent this one to that one. Keep offset. Back into pose mode. We're going to lock the... My hope is that all of this seems a little bit redundant at this point, because that means you just totally get it. Here, we're going to do this and that. All that stuff we've already done. So now when we rotate this, it does the hinge. And let's see. If I were more confident, I would just duplicate all of this, but instead I'm just going to do it all again. So here we go. Over here, this will be the expansion bone, the piston bone, the hinge, and the little IK control bone, which are going to parent to the main handle here. Control P, keep offset, pose mode. I'm going to do the same thing. Lock the IK, but this one is stretchable. And, oh, that's right. Also give it the, and now, look at that. Here, let me model up everything real quick so we can kind of see what we're doing. And just in case I never said it before, you select the object, shift-click on the rig, then you go into pose mode, select the bone you want to be the parent, and hit Control P. It's a little bit weird because you have to be going through modes with multiple objects selected, but you get used to it really quick. I think there's also a way to be in both modes at once, but I forget how to do that actually. It would probably save some time though. But here we go. And I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't as interesting for you as it is for me. It's just, I've been doing so much kit bashing where, I scan some stuff and I put some stuff together and I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of looks like a thing. Like, making a thing that kind of looks like just the thing, adding little greebles and stuff that are kind of just like nonsense is, I figured out kind of how to do that. And so for me, the next goal is, can I actually think things through so that the stuff all kind of fits together? Like right here, this can only rotate so far before this bolt intersects with this main area right here, which means what we could do is we could actually model a chunk out of this piece to give it a little bit more room so that it can kind of intersect. And you do that process a couple times and suddenly the object actually does kind of look engineered. Yesterday I was working on the shot where Sterling grabs a control and slams it forwards. And I just wanted to make it a little bit more interesting, so I added a tiny little random IK linkage coming off of it to just kind of imply that maybe it was some other parallel, it's controlling something else in parallel, and it was kind of ad hoc added on after the fact or something like that. It was, I don't know, it's just it's a little something to make it not the most obvious idea of a lever. Anyways, I've got some videos. The big boat shoot is actually coming up. I'm touring the boat the day after tomorrow. I think I'm going to make a video just kind of catching you up on where all the dynamo stuff is going. Planning has taken up most of my last month, and I'm really excited to talk about that. Maybe I can do a little boat tour for you guys when I go on the boat tour. I should do that. I'll let you go. Thanks for hanging out. Again, this one was kind of more just like brainstorming and figuring things out, but hopefully there's something useful or interesting or fun in there. Have a good one. I will talk to you soon.